I have limited knowledge. However, one of the first things I want to say about that the terminology, and going back to my late uncle's wishes, he was one of the former chiefs. He was the one who got that sign changed on the roads. Now it says Frog Lake Historical Site, but for the longest time it used to say Frog Lake Massacre Site. So he didn't like the term massacre. Because, in his opinion, Frog Lake did not massacre anybody. Now, as far as start is, it wasn't the Frog Lake people, first and foremost. There was an agency there, government agency, where the historical site is. So you had, I'm not sure what they were called then, whether they were called Indian Affairs but they had agents, Indian agents that worked there. They had priests there because the government worked hand in hand with churches, and hence, of course, has history proven itself, residential schools. Basically to take the Indian away from the Indian, right? So, but anyway, I remember stories from my great-grandfather, Joe Onipagweta. I believe at the time his dad would have been a young man there. But they lived at the south point of Frog Lake itself. And that's where the First Nation members of Frog Lake Band all lived. So it was like a kind of a town site. I believe if you look carefully enough, even today, you'll see outlines of old buildings that were there, log houses and stuff. So that's where the encampment was, Frog Lake First Nation people. And there wasn't that many back then. And of course, the historical site, as the crow flies, would be about 1.5 miles directly south of the southest point of Frog Lake. And that's, of course, where the incident happened, that people call massacre. Now, we had a visiting chief at the time, Big Bear. And he stopped here to ask if he could stay for a while. According to legend, I say legend because it's hearsay, he asked to stay there while he's deciding where he wants a reserve. He hadn't signed on treaty yet. And that's one of the reasons why he didn't sign, because he wanted some prime real estate and wasn't getting it. And but he stayed there with his family, his warriors, his warrior chiefs, and his son was a war chief, among other young tribal members. And so the incident took place because of rations. Now, the history books that you would learn in school, like Heinsberg School, for example, off-reserve schools, tell a certain story. That Big Bear tribe kind of lost it and killed everybody. Okay. Well, there's a story behind that, according to my great-grandfather. Now, where he got that from, his story was from his, of course, his dad and grandfather before that. So what they heard, again, it's hearsay, so it's legend. What they heard was one of the warriors, and I'm not sure if it was Aimsees or Wandering Spirit, Papama Chakwu. They went to ask the Indian agent for extra rations because their families were hungry. So he went to the Indian agent's building, and the Indian agent said, "No, I just gave you rations. You should have had enough." That's why they're called rations. You're supposed to eat only so much a day or so much a meal. So according to legend, he asked if he would be allowed to go out of camp to go hunt to find some sustenance. And he was told no, he had to stay within the camp. So he kind of went back to his camp like a dog with a tail between their leg, like kind of kicking the dirt on the way back, I guess, just to draw a picture of it with words. So anyway, he was embarrassed that he didn't get any food for his family. So he was out and about in the camp trying to catch gophers for sustenance to eat or whatever. In the meantime, his wife had left the teepee or the camp, whatever structure it was. I'll use teepee or tent, but they're home. And came back with rations. And he asked her, well, where did you get that? She said, from the Indian agent. Well, I went to him and he didn't give me anything. How did you get it? Traded for sex. He saw red, like any man would have. I would have saw red if my wife had to trade sex for food to feed her family. He saw red, hence history. He goes there and confronts the Indian agent, and lo and behold, how many people died, right? Some were able to get away. Those people got away, made it to the little town site at the south point of Frog Lake. So the Frog Lake First Nation members at the time hid some of these survivors. Gowanluck was one of them. Gowanluck family. Now there's a book out there somewhere. I don't know. One of the descendants of Gowanluck, I believe it's Gowanluck, that wrote a book and kind of put it together like ours, except for the fact of the trading of the sex, okay? They didn't know that part. This is what we were told as we were growing up, is what sparked this murderous rampage. But the Frog Lake people saved some of these Europeans. Some of the kids hid underneath the dresses of the older ladies. So when the warriors came by and asked where did they go, did they come here? Our ancestors said no, they didn't come here. So a handful of them were saved. So after that, my great-grandfather said that an elder by the name of Testexquis had made the journey to Fort Pitt to go sign on for a treaty. Because at that point, we didn't have treaty yet, as far as my great-grandfather's story was. So after that, they had designated some people to be chief and headmen. And one of my great ancestors, Wanipaguetao, was a headman and under Chief Tetsexquis. But that was after he made the journey with either a handful or the whole tribe. How many there was, I'm not sure. Maybe 20, 30 people, I don't know. Can't put a number on it, but it was a small tribe of Frog Lake people. And they made the trip, we figure, either by horse or even by walking to Fort Pitt. And there's an old trail that we used to use to go to Anya Lake back in the day, wagon trips. And we were told that was the same trail that he took to go sign the treaty. And that's one of the reasons why the new high school is named after his namesake. And it's out of respect because education is part of the treaty. So it's only fitting that, his name is being used there. So, like I said, there may be some signs yet at the South Point where there was physical evidence that people had lived there. When I grew up, and I'm going back and I'm going to date myself, 56 years ago. Yeah. I was 6 years old. We were living at the South Point, just above the hill from the South Point, in a log cabin with a dirt roof with my grandparents. And I remember when we used to go fishing at the South Point of the lake, I could see remnants of where there was a kind of a homestead area for old log buildings and stuff. And my grandfather used to say that's where the first Frog Lake people lived. After that, there was people that moved further out this way in the northern part of the community. We eventually moved to where I live now, which is just half a mile from here, and grew up there. And there are other stories that my grandfather used to share with me, like some of the last names, and I'm not going to go into that, don't belong here. They came from somewhere else. I don't agree with the terminology of don't belong here. They're here. They're one of us. They're family. How they ended up here is immaterial to them being members here. I believe in my world, in my mind, that the Creator allows certain things to happen for a purpose. So maybe some of these people needed a place to go and they were brought here. And now we have multiple different last names, and which in my world is fine. It's like being asked a lot of times, are you a First Nation or a Canadian? Well, I'm both. I'm a First Nation roots, but I'm a Canadian because Canada is Canada and I live in Canada, and as of this year, there's been some mixed emotions on the Canadian flag. A lot of First Nations are not flying it because of the residential schools, because of the fines of unmarked graves. It kind of tears my heart both ways. I feel for the families that lost those children in residential school. However, the Canadian flag is what I served under as a police officer. The Canadian flag is a symbol that my dad went and fought in the Second World War. My grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my adopted son, that's why they're in the Army. And if you count the points on the maple leaf of the Canadian flag, it's got 11 points, I believe, which up until this spring represented treaties 1 to 11. And I had learned that from an elder. He says, count the points on this maple leaf. There's 11 points. Which, in my mind, the elder said, in my mind, that's treaty 1 to 11. Ironically, yeah, I guess, but... So there's that. So there was a lot of mistrust. So right off the get-go, Frog Lake did not trust the government, even to this day, to some degree. They did not trust Northwest Mounted Police, now our CMP, because of the historical event that happened here. Northwest Mounted Police were involved. And then the residential schools, our CMP were involved, removing kids from homes, the 60s scoop, So I provide training for young RCMP recruits in our area, and also for provincial employees. And it's called cross-cultural sensitivity training. And it's to share why there's mistrust or distrust, because of things that have happened. So every time I do that, it's a learning experience, because I might get a new question asked, and then I have to research that in my mind, or by asking whichever elders are left behind. We're getting to the point there's only maybe not even a handful of elders in our community that could share this knowledge. And the ones that are left behind are sometimes reluctant to share it because of the hurts and the pains it had caused, the traumas, and I was lucky. I was not one of the residential school, but I am a day school survivor. Of course, I didn't experience a lot of the stuff that the other kids or my other relatives would have experienced because of my skin color. So I went to provincial school at an early age in Heinsberg, and didn't have it rough. But I seen how rough it was on my relatives from here, my cousins. And so I was kind of lucky. Hence my nickname's Muniao, because I look like a white man, and that's what a Muniao is, a white man. But I was taught the traditional way, and as far as the history is concerned, that's about all that I could share about the historical site. As far as great-grandfather was concerned, he wanted that message to get across that it was because of the ration, the denying of the ration, and then getting it because of a trade. He said any man would have saw red. Even to this day, like in this new millennium, if my wife had to do that, I'd see red. And I would probably take it out on whoever imposed it on her, right? So, but after that, we learned to get along. We learned to make a community as it is now. It was a long, hard journey. Like I said, there was a last name thing. There was a north and south thing here at one time. I went to the day school on the south side here, and there was a day school on the north side. So I never seen some of these people my age until later on into our teens, because they went at the north side, we went south. So there was a definite north and south. So there was always conflicts, minor, thank goodness, but there was always a conflict. When we first amalgamated to build that one school up north, it had its learning curves, because all of a sudden you have two sets of children, the south side and the north side, and you're putting them together. So it was kind of volatile at first. However, we've learned to get along to a certain degree. We've learned to get healthy over that. So that's about all I can share. What would it be called? The unfortunate incident. Because that's what it was. It was an incident that unfortunately happened. I've often wondered, if that didn't happen, what would Frog Lake look like? Would Big Bear have been part of our community? Because it was so close to the lake and sustenance with fish and wildlife? Or would he have gotten the prime real estate he wanted along the river? But an unfortunate incident happened. So I think my late uncle was asked the same question. He just opted for historical site because it was history that happened there. He just didn't want that word massacre. A massacre, in our opinion, is a total wipeout of something or somebody. So they weren't totally wiped out. Some were saved. So that's what it would be, an unfortunate incident. And that's why I said about the mistrust. That's how it affected the survivors. You know, and I'm sure the European survivors mentally, in the back of their mind somewhere, would not trust First Nation or Indian people, you know, and understandably so because of what they went through, right? Any trauma you go through, you're not going to trust the other side. Even today, I see that with the residential survivors and the day school survivors. Mm-hmm. You know, they're reluctant to do things. They're afraid to say the wrong thing or to upset somebody, upset the wagon type of thing. It's, for some of them, it's easier for them to shelf it somewhere and leave it there, right? Which is not healthy. And we know that, I know that, and even they know that. But for them, that's the easiest way. Is, okay, you know, for the longest time, I was a victim of that because of the things I seen in the police force. What I was exposed to, like decapitated heads or, you know, decapitated body parts or spewing blood from a chest or whatever, or a headless body because of a gunshot, right? Those are traumatic visuals that you have to live with for the rest of your life. One that sticks out in my mind is head-on collision where the vehicle burst into flames. I couldn't save a family. I had singed my hand, even though I was wearing a glove, trying to open the door, but they were jammed so tight that I couldn't save them. I had to listen to two kids in the back seat cry to their death from the burns. So those kind of things, that kind of trauma makes people second guess in their life. Maybe it is good, but I guarantee you 9 times out of 10, it's not good. Because you may have passed up an opportunity for something good. You see? And so that's how it kind of reroutes you. We have to find a way to get through that. I found ways to get through mine. I'm lucky I'm married to a woman who has, I forget what it's called, something to do with mental first aid or something like that. And I've seen counselors and I've seen elders. Like, I'm not shy to say, yeah, I go see a counselor once a month. You have to. You have to. Because you don't want to miss good opportunities in your life, you know? So, and the things we have experienced, somehow, we pass them on to the next generation. You know, unless we deal with it here, our kids are going to carry it, and our grandkids are going to carry it. And prime example is residential school, right? Because these kids come out of residential school, they didn't learn how to parent, let alone be grandparents, because they were taught a certain way in there. You know, their life was turned around in there. And I made a comment to my daughter here when we had our walk for residential school, like the orange shirt day walk. And I publicly made a comment to her. I said, I'm sorry, my girl, that I haven't been the dad I should be. She's 20 years old now. But I said, obviously, as you can see from your nephews and nieces, I'm a far better grandfather than I was a dad. Because my grandfather raised me, so I was raised from a grandfather's love and perspective. So that's what I learned. I wasn't raised by a dad. So I didn't know how to be a dad. And I just wanted to get that message that could happen. I got away with murder, I guess, because my grandfather, spoiled me. And my great-grandfather spoiled me because I was the oldest great-grandson. So I had those two perspectives, and that was ingrained in my head. And now I show it with my grandkids. So I'm a little tough on my own kids, but, it's just, I didn't learn to be a dad. I learned to be a grandpa. So First Nations, yes, these incidences like Duck Lake, for example, in Saskatchewan, which was part of this, became Riel Rebellion. One of them is like Frog Lake, Fort Pitt, and then Duck Lake. Almighty Voice, right? Kasukuit, killing an Indian department cow just because it had an ID brand on it. In his mind, Almighty Voice's mind, that was their cow because it said Indian department. His tribe was hungry, so he killed it, and that's what they hunted him for. Killing an animal that belonged to the Indian department, not so much to the Indian. So that changed a lot of things. So a lot of chiefs after that were always very careful how they enunciated their verbiage. What am I wanting to say? I better use the proper terminology. And it's from those learned lessons, right? So now I've been telling people, and I'm glad you're recording this, use this part for at least to carry forward, is we're now at the age of Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nation, okay? People identify themselves as a First Nation member of Frog Lake, or an Aboriginal member of Frog Lake, or an Indigenous member of Frog Lake. I identify myself as a Cree Indian of Frog Lake. The fear there is the treaties refer to Treaty Indian of Canada. And none of those passages in those treaties allude to Indigenous peoples, Aboriginal peoples, or First Nations peoples. And ironically enough, it's the government that's telling us to be politically correct how we identify ourselves. Same reason why you can't say black person is why they don't want us to say Indian person. Well, I'm a proud Cree Indian from Frog Lake. I may not look it, but I'm a proud Cree Indian. And I say that because I don't want to derogate from my own treaties with the Crown. Because if we start self-identifying ourselves with those other three titles, we're taking ourselves right out of the treaties. Just because somebody told us it's not politically correct to call ourselves Indian.